Okay, well, I think we can get started. If people come in a little later, that's fine. I want to thank everybody for coming today. As you know, this is a little session that we're calling Remembering the 60s now that we're in our 60s, and myself and the other panelists up here are all from the class of 68. I want to say that I got the idea for this, having this panel, from Heather Tobis Booth of the class of 67, who had a panel very similar to this last year, which I attended. And I was very impressed with the panel she had put together and the discussions that went on. And we're going to do it a little differently from what Heather did. Last year, she focused primarily on the sit-in of 1966, the Students Against the Rank. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was a lot of the other events that occurred that have not been documented by the university or by the press all that much. And in fact, you can see up here on the board, there is a library archive that we're starting to form. We're trying to get as many documents pertaining to the 60s that we can into this archive. So if you have anything, you know of anything, you hear of anything in print or any audio recordings or video recordings, you can contact Eric Horner, who's our very capable alumni employee here, Alumni Association employee, and he will take care of getting them to the right hands. So I really want to thank everybody for coming today. And I just want to give a little background of where we were when we got here in 1964. We got out of high school. We came to the University of Chicago, a very prestigious university, which had a unique curriculum that had been originally started by Robert Maynard Hutchins back in the 30s. Now, of course, Hutchins had retired from being the president of the University of Chicago. But by 1950, the curriculum had become so unique that Martin Gardner, a distinguished mathematician and writer, was quoted as saying, "Word spread around the country that the University of Chicago was a former Baptist school where Jewish professors were now teaching Catholic theology to atheists." Now, this also has been stated a slightly different way. The University of Chicago is a Baptist institution where atheistic professors teach Jewish students about St. Thomas Aquinas. So here we were coming out of high school, and one of the events, some events had occurred just before we got here in the fall of 1964. You probably recall that there were a lot of civil rights activities in the South. There was the civil rights workers that had come down to help with the integration efforts, and there were some people that got murdered right in the summer of '64. And so that was something that may have been on people's minds. The other thing that happened that was probably the most significant event as far as we were all concerned was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in August of 1964. And that was the one event that gave President Lyndon Johnson the authority to start whatever he wanted to in Vietnam and continue to escalate ad infinitum. It basically, if it rings a bell with something that's happened in recent years in Iraq, you know, you may be correct. It passed the House 416 to 0, and I should say, the incident that was purported to have occurred was a North Vietnamese attack on a U.S. warship that had been stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin. Apparently, from what I've read, years later, it was proven to have been a false assertion that there hadn't been no attack. But this was the basis for sending troops to Vietnam without even a declaration of war, as a matter of fact. But Congress passed this resolution. The vote was unanimous in the House, 416 to 0. In the Senate, it was 88 to 2. The two opposing senators were Ernest Gruning of Alaska and Wayne Morse of Oregon. Wayne Morris, I think, made this famous quote, this will end up being a historic mistake, something like that. He knew something, I don't know why. But anyway, that's what we were faced with, and when we got to Chicago, the Vietnam War was just getting started. There were about 25,000 troops there. By the end of 1965, there were 184,000 troops. By the end of 1966, there were 389,000. End of 67, 486,000. And by 1968, 537,000. So one thing that I think affected me was, as we progressed through our years at Chicago, people had to start thinking about what's going to happen after we graduate. We all had our student deferments, all the men in the classes, and at some point we were going to lose those. And I think there was an exception for medical school, and there might have been some exceptions for certain teachers in inner cities, I believe. But the draft was paramount in the minds of a lot of undergraduates. So just to kind of summarize very briefly, some of the events that I took part in my years at Chicago, protest marches and sit-ins and so on. There was a teach-in in spring of '65, which was all about the Vietnam War. Had a variety of speakers, including someone from Vietnam. I think there might be someone from the State Department, all kinds of people. This was the second such teach-in in the country. It was April of '65. The first one was at the University of Michigan. And there were 800 people in Mandel Hall, and some of you might remember, you might have been there. Also in 1965, the House Un-American Activities Committee was having hearings on the north side of Chicago, trying to still, at that date, 1965, accuse people of treason or whatever by being communists, members of the Communist Party. I went to this demonstration there, and I was shocked when I got up there because I thought, HUAC? That's something from like 1955, 56. This is 1965? They still have HUAC? But they sure did. You know, it was a big deal. And then, of course, during the years 65 to 68, there were many anti-war marches in Washington, D.C. There was a big one in New York. I went on both of those. In the spring of '66, there was the big sit-in, Students Against the Rank, in the ad building. And in the summer of '66, if you were in Chicago at that time, you were probably aware that Jesse Jackson was leading these open housing demonstrations in these very highly segregated areas of Chicago. Martin Luther King came up one time and appeared. I went on some of those as well, and some other students did too. And then culminating in '68 was the Special Vietnam Convocation that some of you may have been part of. And this was to honor those students who had signed pledge cards saying that they would not fight in Vietnam. And it was held the Friday night before the main graduation in Rockefeller Chapel, and the main speaker was Noam Chomsky. And that was a very big deal. So let me introduce the panelists briefly, and they will briefly introduce what their background is and what they were doing in Chicago and what they're doing now. On your right, my far left, we have Howard Lorber, and next to him is Dan Coker, and Phil Giraldi is next to me. So the question is, the activities of the '60s had a tremendous impact on each of us, both at that time as well as in shaping our lives afterward. What event from your Chicago years was the most influential in retrospect, and how have you changed? So Dan, you want to?
Thank you, John, for changing the ground rules.
They changed automatically. I had nothing to do with it.
In order to get even, I'd like to correct John. First, I'd like to thank him. He put in a huge amount of work, and he really did months on the internet and stuff. But I'd like to correct him. We didn't have 25,000 troops, John. They were advisors.
All advisors.
For advisors.
Thank you, yes, yes. The language is very important, they say, yes.
Well, I have to use it, I was a student, I have to use that term lightly because the advice is here and knows the truth. But I came here in '64 as a student. I came from a very liberal household. My father was a union organizer. So I came here a very liberal person. But I was not politically oriented at the time. I came here, I had just, like I said, I lived in Burton Judson. My interests were, how do you get a date if you live in Burton Judson?
He still doesn't know the answer.
I agonized over that question. And then I also learned very quickly the true meaning of the University of Chicago, C. Okay? And so those things were started for me. And I almost wish Howie hadn't gone first because the Roy Gutman thing, it was not a week goes by that I didn't think about that. It was horrible. I guess the most important things for me is I was not an organizer, I was not a leader, I was sort of, I thought, an ad hoc foot soldier. And I attended events when I felt like it. In fact, I didn't even like the people who organized the events. And I've been trying to talk to some of you guys, well, how come I didn't like some of those people? You know, when they go with their bullhorns, you know, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, I go, my God, I don't know if I like them or Ho Chi Minh more. They irritated me. But I got involved in my two big events was the Pentagon in '67, which was one of the highlights of my life, okay? And we went back for them, John and Marlene and I went back 4 years later, yeah, but I mean,
40.
when was it, in October, November, we went back, and we did this stuff, the anniversary march just half a year ago. And so there's sort of interesting comparisons there that we might get into a little later. And then I was a Grant Park in the convention, the nights of the riots outside the Conrad building, and I was one of those people outside rioting. And I was also here in '69, things for the moratorium. Something else, you know, and the business students sort of marched in their suits and ties, and I was booing them, and you'll see how this sort of ties in a second. And so, but I guess if you look back, and then I'll pass it on, was when I synthesized through all these things, that I guess the things that was when I came to Chicago, I saw the United States in sort of Bush terms as the good guy. You know, we were a country that we were a little bit better, that you could sort of trust that our soldiers went over to help people. And I sort of bought into that we were on the right side. It's in '64. And I left a terribly cynical person. And that cynicism has stayed with me throughout my life. And then from those particular events, I guess, was that the fear and the hate that I saw exposed in these various things. At the Pentagon, you know, the armies of the night. I was one of those guys at the night, you know, with 3 feet away from the troopers and the paratroopers and stuff. And when we drove out to the Pentagon, and night we stopped at a bus stop in Pennsylvania. And also the fear that I saw, for example, when the delegations came back from the amphitheater and they're voting, and they lied because we had the radio on, and they lean out of the bus going, we voted for McCarthy, we voted for McCarthy. And we're there while you lying SOBs, we just heard your vote, you know. They were scared to death. You know, we were threatening to turn over their buses and all that. And so this combination of fear and hate has stayed with me from the city.
Okay, Phil?
I have to use a note even for my biography because my memory's not so good anymore. I had a somewhat different experience. I graduated in '68 with an AB in ancient history. I was one of, I believe, 3 Republicans in the class of '68. We were an endangered minority in those days, and we kept a very low profile for a lot of reasons. Within a month of I did not participate in any of the demonstrations. Within a month of graduating, I was at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, in basic infantry training. And the first I heard about the Chicago demonstrations, because of course we weren't allowed to read newspapers or look at television, was when we were called out at 3 in the morning and issued with batons and helmets, just in case all those commies up in Chicago managed to get down to Missouri. So that was the first I heard about it. I spent 3 years in the Army, in Army intelligence. I got out under the GI Bill. I did a master's degree and a PhD in a very obscure historical area, which guaranteed me unemployment for the rest of my life. I then, to my amazement, was accepted by the Central Intelligence Agency as an operations officer, probably the one job that you could get with an obscure PhD. In 1975 and 1976, I went to Italy. My first assignment was to attempt to fix the Italian elections of that year. We were only partially successful. After that, I spent 17 years with the agency in Europe and the Middle East as a counterterrorism officer, terrorism being an area that was comfortable for me and also something that I felt positive about. Since that time, I have been working with private companies in the security area as a consultant. Increasingly, I've been writing on security and intelligence issues, and I'm a contributing editor for the American Conservative magazine. I write for antiwar.com and also for Huffington Post on a regular basis. 1 year ago, I was one of 6 CIA officers who, when George Tenet wrote his book and got a $4 million advance, we wrote a letter suggesting that he might want to give half of that $4 million advance to the families of wounded soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan. Mr. Tenet got angry at that point and declined to do it. I'm currently a foreign policy advisor for former Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul. Well, hopefully he will come back. I've been active in the peace movement since 2002 and spend a considerable amount of my time working on Republican audiences. I go around and speak to groups and explain to them that dismantling the Constitution, torturing people, and declaring war on countries every 2 years is not a Republican virtue. The response to these groups is usually very negative. As for my Chicago experience, I see it in somewhat of a different way. Obviously, I didn't participate in the demonstrations. I was conflicted about Vietnam and everything else, and fairly ignorant about most of the issues. As a result, I basically went with the flow, as did a number of our classmates, to go into the military as the least undesirable option. I have found that since that time, the Chicago experience has come around, and I don't know if I can use this expression, to bite you on the ass. And essentially the skepticism that was inherent in Chicago education and the insistence that when people say something that they actually be able to substantiate what they're saying is something that has shaped the lives of the people that I knew in the class of '68. Many of us who even went in the military have turned out to be, I believe, more radical than some people who started out as radicals in the '60s. Because I assure you, 3 years in the United States Army will radicalize you really, really, really well. And the result is that I think people who've had direct contact with the government, have experienced the government in a more direct way, have in particular with the Chicago background, have been people who have basically now are active in the peace movement. I know a number of them, and basically have become more radical in their old age, which is an unusual turn of events. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Okay, I'm going to, first of all, let me say that the composition of the panel changed slightly from what was printed originally. At some point you might have seen that David Vigoda was listed, and at another point that Dorothy Chin was listed, and neither of them could make it here. So I'm going to take the place of the fourth panelist, even though I was just originally going to be the moderator. But as you know, I like to talk a little bit, as you can see here. So I'm going to answer my own question. The one event that I think, in retrospect, was the most significant and had a long-lasting effect on me was the Special Vietnam Convocation. And basically, the preparation for this was getting people to commit that they would not fight in Vietnam. And if you can, hopefully everyone has a program here that all kinds of things compiled. There is the actual program for the Special Vietnam Convocation. It has the names of everyone who signed a pledge saying they would not fight in Vietnam. In addition, and there are a couple of hundred or so of those, there are a couple of hundred or so signatures of support for women and others who were not eligible to be drafted. So I remember very vividly going around in the weeks preceding our graduation in '68, going around to people in dorms and apartments, and just in the evening when people were studying at home, just knocking on people's doors saying, will you sign this pledge card? And I was amazed that most of the people said, yes, absolutely. I mean, I was in heaven, and I got home that evening, one particular evening, and I found out that Roy Gutman had been shot and killed right at the same time that I was out in the streets, and very close from where I lived, too, right around the corner. So I was very depressed about that, of course. Nevertheless, the plans for the convocation went on, and in fact, it was dedicated to Roy Gutman, if you can see in the program. At the same time that we were doing that, we were putting together, a bunch of us were putting together this Living at War booklet. It was all volunteer work. I remember collating the pages was 100% done by hand by about 25 people. And we had, the printer was, I can't remember the building, I think it was somewhere on Woodlawn Avenue. This fellow that was a printer volunteered to have his printing press. He set it up in the basement of this big building, and in the dining room of this house, every once in a while he'd bring up a couple of more sets of pages, and we would be running around the table grabbing the pages and collating them together. And this went on for days and days and days and days, and finally it got all put together. My recollection is we sold a few copies. There might have been 300 or 400 copies of it. Maybe we sold them for $1 or $2 just to cover the printing costs. This was put together and edited by Alan Barabay, who unfortunately just passed away this last December, and Dave Worstel. And in particular, I want to call your attention to what to me is one of the most incredible things in here. It's a letter from Dave Worstel's attorney to his draft board, basically saying that Dave will be glad to serve in the military if the following conditions are met: that he doesn't commit genocide, that he doesn't kill innocent villagers, and so on and so forth. And it asked for the signatures of Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States. I'm trying to find this here. Louis B. Hershey, who was Director of Selective Service, and the commanding officer of the United States Induction Center. And he got a response from them. So, you know, this kind of stuff is priceless. You're not going to see this in the New York Times or anywhere else. But I hope everyone gets a copy of this as well. So, but at any rate, the Vietnam Convocation, interestingly enough, was not covered by the press. I had thought it was. My recollection of being there was that there were a lot of people in the audience and that there were some members of the press. But I, in researching everything that I could about the 60s, could find no mention of it anywhere. However, I did find a mention of a similar event in Berkeley, probably the week after or something, maybe at the same time. And who was we had, by the way, we had Noam Chomsky as our main speaker. Who did they have at Berkeley as their main speaker? Robert Maynard Hutchins. 1968. excuse me, it was a little before ours. It was May 17th. Robert Maynard Hutchins basically said to the class of 68 who had signed similar pledges not to go to Vietnam, he said, the students and teachers represented here have awakened the conscience of America and have changed the course of history. So it's very interesting that the connection between the guy who started our curriculum that we were educated under, later on went to California and said, hey, you student protest, even though our administration wasn't listening to us here in the 60s, the former president was saying, go ahead, you guys. So anyway, does anybody want to comment on the panel about anything that someone else said here? No?
We're all friends.
We're all friends. Well, yeah, we're friends, but... oh.
Just maybe I'd like to comment a little briefly, because you guys are, thank goodness, going to get a chance to participate as far as I'm concerned, as soon as possible. But just some of the changes. I mean, when we came to the university, you know, we had the girls check-in stuff in the tunnel and all that. You know, 1 or 2 years later, there was nude swimming in Ida Noyes Hall. I mean, you know, it's astounding. My first year, there was a little thing out, 15 people went, so I know I had to be almost the only person who went from here. As a joke, Art Linkletter, if you remember, came, you were there? Art Linkletter came to Ida Noyes, and there, I mean, and, you know, and then a couple of years later, it's Muhammad Ali, and, you know, and all these great guys. I mean, it was really, my goal here is just to remind you, I mean, I bet you never thought of Art Linkletter. I mean, it's like, I mean, thank God, you know, but I mean, just to realize and think back, if you just some isolated things as to how the changes we and how it must have affected us. And I have struggled talking to Marlene and John and stuff of, well, how did it really change me? It had to. And I'm asking you to think about that. You know, I'm not sure how it changed. It embittered me, and it turned me into a much more cynical person, not in personal relationships, but overall. But going to college, and we did, had to be different, say, than a U of C kid that was here from 88 to 92 or something. It must have done something to us or to you. And I want, you know, and that's why I'm just trying to get you to think that away so we can, you know, share that.
Yeah, because it's really, big events touch us, but they don't really change us. What changes is the ebb and flow of day-to-day life. And the kinds of things that happen from the day we got here when we had to have the door, if we had a guest in our room, we had to have the door open and 1 foot on the floor, and people checked, to when, you know, at the end, where no one was checking on anything. And I don't think there were any feet on the floor. So there were a lot of changes in our everyday life, and those have the real impact, because it's those single events, the big events, you know, they kind of pass over you like a wave, and they may leave you a little wet, but you dry off pretty quickly. So I'm just wondering also what other people's reactions are to what they remember about, or what they, if they didn't live through that time, what they think about in regard to that period.
I'm going to butt out of turn just a second. I want to invite the audience to think about that.
Actually, the plan is to have audience participation in the second half, but we can start a little bit. There's no problem. Dan, go ahead.
And I shared this with John. Tell it. It's not a great story, but the exact moment when you became anti-war. You remember the Chinese resistance.
Yeah.
And I can remember mine, and I'm inviting you if you want to share it to us, you know, if you can, or maybe there wasn't an exact moment, but whatever. You know, I was sitting in the lounge at Salisbury House, at that time, you know, in a dingy little place, and I was reading the Sun-Times, and always on a certain page, and there was the body count. Remember the good old, I think it was Tuesdays, but it might have been Wednesdays. It came out, or something, okay? The body count. And I'm reading the body count, and it was 246 Americans, but, you know, 2,800 Viet Cong, you know. And a guy came in from our dorm, and I said, oh, man, the body count, what was it? And I gave him the numbers. And he was all excited about it. We're winning. We're winning. And I looked at him, and I can't swear here, and I'm thinking, you idiot. What's wrong with you? How can you think like this? There's something wrong here. And that was when I went, literally, and it's a very trivial thing, I admit that, but we don't change it, dramatic events, like, not necessarily, okay? Not everything is the towers going down in your life. And I'm thinking, I went from a person just reading the body count without a great amount of commitment or interest, to all of a sudden walking out of the lounge going, my God, this is idiotically stupid, and just changing whole and becoming, much more active in things. So I'm inviting you to think maybe if you can remember. And one more thing with the ladies in the audience, we lost our one of our members, but I've been sort of thinking, I'm amazed and highly impressed at how involved the women, the girls, whatever, female students got, chicks, whatever Hillary wants me to say, I'll say it, okay? But no, seriously, but how they got so involved in, when really, directly their lives were online. I'm not trying to be shit, and I'd love to get that perspective, if you like to, of that how involved the women got on that issue. It's quite obvious why most of the men did. Yeah. What? Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so let's open it up to discussion, questions, comments, criticism, whatever, anything you want to say. It's a free country still for a little while longer. And if you could, okay, Phil wants to say one thing first, and then, but once we open it up, please state your name and when you graduated or whatever, even if you didn't graduate.
One thing I'm very interested in is your comments or your observations on why 40 years ago is different than now, why the peace movement now is virtually non-existent, and what your speculation would be on that in view of the fact that, at least in my mind, you could make a case for Vietnam in geopolitical terms, or confronted by a communism which was as the fashionable word these days, existential threat against the United States. You could make a case for it. It wasn't a good case, but you could make it. Whereas what's going on with Iraq and everything, you can't make a case for at all. And yet there's no peace movement. So is it that just it's a generational gap, or is it something different?
Yeah, I will say right now, I've always felt, in the last few years, as much as I opposed the draft in the 60s, and I think it's a horrible thing, and I think people should not have to serve in the military to serve their country in general, unfortunately, I think if we had the draft today, we would have been out of Iraq within about 2 years. Can I just add one little thing relating to the draft? In my research, I was able to find information actually put out by the Selective Service System. Actually, there is a requirement that young men register for the Selective Service today. Apparently, not everybody does it. The Selective Service System has put out a report card by state of the states that get either an A, a B, or a C. If you're over 90% compliant with the draft law for your state, you get an A. If you're between 80 and 90, you get a B, and if you're a state that is under 80, you get a C. Now, this is that's good. That's good. This is the map. The green is the A's, the tan color is the B's, and the blue is the C's. And Nevada and New York State got 75 and 78% respectively. Now, I must add that one of the reasons a lot of these states are 99% is those states have a requirement to get a driver's license. You have to register for the draft. This is the year 2000 and whatever. Well, anyway, so there still is a draft, and if the prediction that Phil has made in many of his writings that Bush is going to attack Iran before the end of the year is true, they will be drafting these people. They'll have to.